Robert from Arizona. It's great to see you. He's my
Hey,
friend. He's
hey,
my friend.
Stephen.
How you
It's
doing?
great to see you too. I'm doing fantastic. You and your wife are such a blessing to me. So just want to let you know that, okay? Um,
Thanks.
yeah, I just have a question about Daniel's 70th week. Um,
Because
is there a correlation between the last three and a half years and the book of Revelation 11, 12, and 13, about 3.5 years? That's my question. Or is it at a different time? So it's a pretty straightforward question for you.
yeah, well, some people would make that connection. As you know, there's lots of different views of Revelation, and there's actually probably an equal number of views about Daniel's 70 weeks. But the 70 weeks of Daniel clearly uh, bring us up to the time of Christ, from Daniel's time, essentially, till the time of Christ is in the first 69 weeks. A week in this prophecy of Daniel 9, which is chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, a week is 7 years. So 70 weeks is 490 years. 69 of those weeks is 383 years. And that is the time from a particular starting point, and even that's ambiguous because there's three possible starting points. But from that starting point until the coming of Messiah is said to be 69 weeks total, which is 483 years. Now, the starting point and the ending point are both controversial. Some think that the ending point is the baptism of Jesus. Some think it's the crucifixion of Jesus. Um, and some perhaps might suggest it's the birth of Jesus, but that's not specified. It just says from the going forth of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And I said there are three different ones in different years. Which one is the beginning point is debated. There are advocates for all three. From that time till the Messiah, the Prince, is 69 weeks or 483 years. Well, what point in the life of the Messiah, the Prince? His birth, his baptism, the beginning of his public ministry, his death? We're not told. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the passage. One thing we can say is that Jesus came at the general time that by reckoning any beginning or any of the ending possibilities, uh, nobody but him has ever come as Messiah in that time frame, even close. Now, you were talking about the second half of the 70th week. The 70th week, I believe, begins, and I think you do too, with the baptism of Jesus.
Yeah.
And he ministered for 3.5 years, and in the midst of the week, he ended the sacrificial system. The Messiah was cut off. That is at the crucifixion. The question now is, what is the other 3.5 years of that week?
Yeah.
Uh, and that is as controversial as the other questions. There's as many views on that as there are on what the starting date is and the ending date. So we're really kind of, have to be rather general. But there are those who feel that Jesus died in the middle of the week, and the other 3.5 years are to be seen as fulfilled in the 3.5 years of the Jewish War from 66 to 70 AD. Now, I think that assumption is behind your question. Is this the same 3.5 years we have in Revelation? And there are people who would say yes, because in Revelation, I mean, the people who are seeing Revelation as fulfilled in AD 70, most naturally will see the 3.5 years in Revelation, which is mentioned 5 times in that book, uh, as the Jewish war, and the end of Jerusalem. Uh, this is a possibility. It's only one of several possibilities. I have to say, I'm not dogmatic about some of these things that are ambiguous. There are things that are not ambiguous. Who the Messiah is, who ends the sacrificial system, what it means for the Messiah to be cut off, who the prince of the people who are to come is, who destroyed the temple and the sanctuary, what the abomination of desolation is. I think all of these are fairly easily identified from New Testament data, but several of the details of the prophecy are still extremely up in the air. What was the beginning of the 70 weeks? What is the end of the 69th week? What point in the Messiah's life? Those things, a person could legitimately have different ideas. Now, if the 3.5 years in Revelation is a reference to the Jewish war, and if we identify the second half of the 70th week with that 3.5 years in Revelation, It means that we're looking at a gap between the death of Jesus at the middle of the 70th week and then, of course, AD 70, which would be when the 70th week resumes. So we'd have to assume that in the middle of the 70th week, Jesus is crucified and the clock stops ticking. And it starts ticking again at the beginning of the Jewish war, and 3.5 years tick away the rest of the 70th week with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, probably one of the principal objections to this is that we have often discredited the dispensational view because they see a gap in the prophecy which is not there. That is, it's not mentioned to be there. They think the 69th week ended at the crucifixion of Jesus. They see it differently than I do on that. Then they think the 70th week in its entirety was postponed for over 2,000 years, and that the 70th week won't resume until the rapture of the church and the beginning of the tribulation. In fact, this is the whole argument for a 7-year tribulation, because the Bible never mentions a 7-year tribulation, but they identify the tribulation rather gratuitously with the 70th week of Daniel, which is not said to be a tribulation at all. But that's how dispensations are. And we who are not dispensationalists anymore often say, well, that was kind of a goofy way of looking at things, that, there's no gap between the 69th week and the 70th week in the passage. So why would there be a 2,000-year gap there that is not mentioned? But if we say, well, there's a 40-year gap and it's not mentioned either, someone might say, well, aren't you doing the same thing the dispensationalists do? Now, I'm not necessarily taking that position, but I would say that to say there's one generation in an unmentioned gap between the middle and well, let's just say between the first half and the second half of the 70th week would not be anywhere near as crazy as suggesting that there's a gap unmentioned, which is 4 times as long as the whole, 70-week period itself. The gap is 4 times that long. It really changes the whole contour of the prophecy. And but if there's a delay of the generations at some point, again, it's not mentioned in the text. It would be as legitimate to suggest it as it would be for dispensations to suggest their gap, and maybe even more so. You remember Jesus made the new covenant just before the cross, and then the temple is destroyed in the end of that first 70 years. When Israel came out of Egypt, God made the old covenant at Mount Sinai right away, and then it was 40 years before they came into the promised land, which they were promised before they left Egypt. God's going to lead them out and bring them into the land of Canaan. But instead of doing that immediately, there was an unexpected delay, and that was 40 years where they wandered in the wilderness. Some would say, well, that's analogous to the new covenant. God made the new covenant, and then there was an unmentioned, unpredicted generation of transition from the old covenant to the new until the old disappeared completely in the destruction of the temple. That is a view that is out there. And for those who take a preteristic view of Revelation, it is fairly typical to see the 3.5 years of Revelation as that Jewish war period. And that would, on those assumptions, and I keep saying on those assumptions on that view, because I acknowledge there's a variety of views, and I'm not actually sure which one is right.
Okay.
But on that view, yeah, you could see it that way. Now, another way to see the second half of the 70th week is to see no gap at all, that Jesus died in the middle of the 70th week, and the second half of the 70th week ran its course from that point on and ended some like 3.5 years after Christ died, and rose again. Now, someone might say, well, what happened 3.5 years after Jesus died? Anything of significance? Well, probably. Remember the 70 weeks at the very beginning of the prophecy in verse 24. It says these 70 weeks are determined upon your people, that is Israel, to finish the transgression, to seal up the prophecy, those kinds of things. Well, this would probably suggest that there was going to be 490 years from the beginning of the prophecy till the end of God's unique dealings with Israel. I mean, they're not going to not exist as Jewish race anymore, but they'll exist as a race, but God will not be dealing with them specially anymore. This is their period, their last period. And the crucifixion of Christ, of course, sealed their fate in that respect too. But after Jesus died, the gospel was still preached only to Jews for several years. The exact number of years we don't know, but it was some years before Cornelius, the first Gentile, was recognized as coming into the church. But there's something else too, and that is that Paul, most chronologists would say probably around 3 years or so after the crucifixion, Saul of Tarsus got saved and was commissioned as the first apostle, particularly to the Gentiles, which could mark the end of the period where the Jews were uniquely being dealt with, or especially being dealt with by God. Now we've got an apostle sent directly to the Gentiles, and his commission could easily have occurred 3.5 years after, and in fact, it did occur something like that. Some period similar to that. So one could argue that there's a gap between the first and second halves of the 70th week, and the second half is the Jewish war and the fall of Jerusalem. Or one could argue there's no gap, and that the conversion of Saul, or perhaps the stoning of Stephen, or something like that, kind of ended God's special status in which he held Israel, and his special dealings with them, because the Gentile world then became targeted for evangelism. So those are just thoughts.
That's excellent.
All right, yeah, good to see you, Robert.
Good to see you too. I wanted to say, so I was thinking that so much weight is given to the judgment of Jerusalem, that and what Daniel said about he will cause it to cease, that in my mind I was thinking, well, maybe the first 3.5 weeks went to the destruction of the temple, and the rest is for the whole period till the return of Christ. That's what I was thinking. But I thank you for your response. I'm gonna have to watch this again to get all of it.
Yeah, or you can listen to my lectures on the 70 weeks. I go through a lot of that.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you for your time, sir.
Good to see you, Robert.
Good to see you, sir.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
All right.